This is Vanessa Gorman. We've seen what are the Greek tenses are. Now we have to see how to form them. And we're going to start with active verbs, and we're going to stick with the third person singular and plural. There's no reason to get more complicated yet. So we've had indicative, active, third person singular and plural of the aorist and the imperfect. Now I'm going to show you how you make the others. And I'm going to make mention of something which is a bit controversial, which is something called the sequence of tenses. Now, according to the sequence of tenses, there are things called primary tenses and secondary tenses. And that's about all you need to know right now. The idea here is, and the reason I bring it up is, that primary endings are generally used on what are called the primary tenses, which are the things that represent some form of the present or future. The present, the perfect, the future, and the future perfect. So they tend to have the same endings. And you've already seen this in some of the forms you've looked at, namely the weak aorists have these endings as well. So e, usi, etai, ontai are common endings. And the other tenses, the different past tenses, are en, on, eto, onto. And you've seen these already in your imperfect endings and your weak aorists, or your strong aorists, your second aorists. So remember, verbs have principal parts, and they each have 6 principal parts. The first principal part is what we look them up in the dictionary, the lemma, and that's always the first person singular, present, indicative, active, unless it's an irregular verb and that form doesn't occur. Then they follow with the future, the aorist, the perfect, and then the perfect middle and the aorist passive. And if you want to see links to all principal parts of many, many, many verbs, Mastronarde has a nice link to that, so you can use that. So an example of principal parts are pempo. Pempo is the present, pempso is the future, epempsa is the aorist, pepomfa is the perfect, pepemmai is the perfect middle, and epemphane is the aorist passive. And this is always going to be the case. Likewise, archo, likewise, poieo, and you'll see some characteristics, balo. Some characteristics. So notice how the 6th principal part always ends with then. That's going to be important. Notice how we get the common, these are called primary endings on the perfect middle. We've already dealt at length with the present stem because we get the aorist from it, and the imperfect from it, and the aorist stem, the third one, that's what we get the aorist from. So we've already seen aorists, where you take the third principal part, which has, if it's a first aorist, it has a sigma in the stem. If it's a second aorist, it does not. If it's a first aorist, you put en and on to form the third person singular and plural. If it's a second aorist, you use en and on. No sigma. Both of them get the augment. So these are forms you've seen a million times by now, right? Epempse, epempson, right? Balen, ebalon. So these are forms that you should be pretty familiar with right now. The present stem is what we use to form the imperfect. And again, you add the augment and then these secondary endings, en and on, right? Epempen, epepon. We've seen these. This is no problem for you. So what I'm going to show you is that forming the others are not so hard either. The present, you just take this present stem, take the O off it, and add the endings a and usi. These are the primary sequence endings. So pempse, pempsusi, pempusi, excuse me, pempe, pempusi are the present forms he sends, they send. Archo, becomes arche, archusi. He rules, they rule. Poieo, it contracts to poie, because it's a contract verb. Epoiusin, he makes, they make. They are making. They do make, right? Bale, balusi, to throw or cast. So the present is really easy to make. And likewise, the future is very easy to make because you make it exactly the same way as the present, only you use the second principal part. And the general difference between the first and the second principal part is that the sign of the future is a sigma. And so it tends to stick a sigma in there. So pempo becomes pempso. Pempe is the present. Pempse is the future. So it looks just like the present, but has a sigma stuck in there. Now, there are, of course, exceptions because, for example, balo, the future loses a lambda and becomes a contract. That's just a result of linguistic transformations when you add the sigma in there. Notice that you only have one lambda in the aorist as well. So the only difference between the second aorist and the imperfect is the second aorist has one lambda. The imperfect coming off the present stem has two. The perfect is the fourth principal part with, again, these endings. These endings change a little bit because of the kappa. The sign of the present is two things. One is a kappa instead of a sigma. The other is what we call reduplication, which means you double the beginning sound. So pempo becomes pe-pom-fa. So the P plus a K turns into a phi. And the vowel changes. Again, that's linguistics. We'll leave that one alone. Pempo becomes pe, pom, fa. Arco becomes ercha. Poieo becomes pe, poie, ka. Balo becomes beble, ka. So you see transformations happens, which is why they list these principal parts so you can see how the stem changes. But essentially, since you're not reproducing these, all you have to know is perfect tense is translated has or have. It typically will have something doubled. In this case, for example, the A is doubled, the alpha, and it becomes an eta as a result. The P is doubled, so we get pe. The B is double, so you get be. This makes it harder to look things up in the dictionary, of course, because you have to figure out what the stem is going to be, but Alphaeus will do it for you. So reduplication, and then the stem, and then a K, and then the endings N and asi. So pep, poie, kasin, you see the kappa, you see the reduplication, you say, aha, it's a perfect, translate it has or have. It's from poieo, so he has done, he has made. You use the same stem to form the pluperfect. The difference is you also add an augment to it, so it becomes even more complicated. And then you use these a-son endings. Otherwise, it's got the reduplication and the kappa, and you translate it with had, but it's got the augments. So if I see this form here, and I have no idea what it comes from, I look at pepo and say it's reduplicated, and I see the A on the front, alpha, yeah, eta on the front, sorry, alpha, epsilon, I can't get it, epsilon on the front. I know it has an augment, and therefore I'm thinking it's a pluperfect. So if I know that, and the Morpheus tool will confirm it, then you just know translate it had. And so these are formed from the fourth principal part. They look a lot like the perfect, except different endings and an augment on the front. In sum, a lot of these look very familiar to you. The ones that matter, the imperfect Inneris, you already know. The present is going to come up fairly often. The perfect and future more often than the pluperfect, but not very often, and the pluperfect very rarely. The future perfect almost not at all. I'm not even going to give it to you here. If you see it identified that way, you know how to translate it. And that's the trick with these. Okay, you can learn all the forms, great, and you will learn them by use, but look for the signs. Aorist, imperfect, Future or pluperfect, you're looking for augments. The present or the perfect, you're looking for a reduplication. The future, you're looking for a sigma, right? The aorist will have a sigma if it's a first aorist. These are the signals that will help you read these words. Now, what do you do with deponents and me verbs in these tenses? Of course, they're going to be unusual because they're going to have what is essentially a middle form. And you can see it from the principal parts. When the first principal part ends with my, you know it's a deponent. And so you're going to see some of the same things. Aphikneomai, aphixomai. So you see that sigma in there. We've already seen the imperfect and aorist. The future, sorry, the present aphiknetai, and I'm not even putting in the future in there because frankly it just doesn't occur. Gignomai, the aorist and imperfect, we've already seen. The present is just gignetai and gignontai. So these are the primary endings. The future, gigne setai, gigne sontai, coming from the second principal part with the primary endings. We see the same thing with erkomai. You simply add these primary endings to the first principal part or the second principal part. Here you see the second principal part is very different. It probably came from a different stem. They've taken two very discrete words and glommed them together. Happens sometimes. Hegeomai, the same thing. So you get hegetai, hegontai, so they're contracted. And you see that with the circumflex. And the future has the sigma and the primary endings. Finally, mahomai is the last of these, looks just like the others. The difference here is that the future adds an epsilon to the stem, and so it contracts as well, instead of having a sigma. Me verbs are irregular. They're always irregular, so you just have to kind of learn them. The good news is that me only has 3 tenses. We've already learned ain and ason. The present third persons are st and ac, and notice they are enclitics. They do not have accents on them as a rule. And the futures are estai and esontai, which don't occur that often. Esontai more often than estai, but again, mostly you see either presents, which are everywhere, or imperfects, which are everywhere. Histemi, to stand. We've already seen the imperfect and the aorists. The present, histasin, histasin, stasetai, stasontai. Again, these are just completely irregular. You can just memorize them if you want to, or you can use the morphological tool to analyze them. Didomi, to give. Didosi, didoasi. You're seeing a pattern here. Didosai, dosusi. Apolumi, same thing. So you're going to see the present tense and the future tense pretty easy to identify. We've already seen the aorist and the imperfect, and the others are just not going to show up that often. You just need to know how to translate them, and now you know roughly how they're formed, although it's not something I'm going to worry about obsessing on.